and start the book reading. The Broken Circle, Chapter 6, The Custer of Farmington. You can skip a stone across the San Juan River, which is all that separates the city limits of Farmington from Navajo country. But for the first half of this century, there was not a lot of daily contact between cultures in the area of the reservation. Most Navajo lived great distances from town, roads were unpaved, and horse-drawn wagons were the primary means of transportation, which limited travel, but Navajo life also remained traditional and old-fashioned because the Dene were an independent and aloof people who seemed still to be undecided as to whether or not they wanted to join the rest of the world. When they came to town, following routes marked by cairns and roads that forded washes, it was usually to buy, sell, and trade for goods and services they could not get at the trading posts. Their stays were usually brief. If they remained overnight, they kept to themselves, camping on the south side of town among the cottonwoods along the river, where the townfolk would hear them drumming and singing, and the night air was fragrant with the smoke of their fires. When the time came to return, when the business that had brought them to town had been transacted, they would trundle out of town as if they couldn't wait to get back to their familiar sights and sounds of their home ground. People who have lived here a long time do not recall there being much friction between Indians and whites during the days. To hear the old-timers talk, locals had an abiding respect for the Navajo because they were tough and enduring, like a desert plant that can grow where all else has given up. You have to take your hat off to them people, a lifetime resident told me. They can survive on little or nothing. Those who lived among the Navajo also found them trustworthy in a unique way, Dan Sullivan. My granddaughter used to say, if you can't trust an Indian, you can't trust nobody. We had campsites all over this country, cow camps, sheep camps right in the middle of the Indian land, and we never lost so much of a cup of flour. Oh, if they were hungry and ran out, sure, they'd help themselves to some, but they never took all your flour. They take enough to last till they could make a trip to the trading post, and when they got theirs, they'd pop back up with yours. The Navajo's credit rating back then gave rise to the saying, if an Indian tells you he'll bring you 2 sheep in the morning, you can go to the bank and draw money on it. That is not what the whites were impressed. They reciprocated in kind and were as good as their word in their dealings with Navajos. Far from it, many traders and storekeepers took advantage of the Navajos' ignorance of commercial practices by inflating prices, charging outrageous interest rates, underpaying for rugs, livestock, and Navajo labor, and selling pawn before the expiration of the redemption period. While misunderstandings were to be expected in almost any cross-cultural situation, the deception of local Indians was fairly common business practice, which generated bad feelings and resentment among the Navajo, but their outright protests. There was not a lot of anxiety about hostility and violence from the Navajos on the part of whites during this period. The lesson of the long walk seemed to have taken the fight out of the Navajo for good. They even appeared to be complacent to the ritual of relations that had evolved over the years. By conforming unthinkingly to the realities of existing social structure, Navajos might have to put up in paternalism and exploitation, but that beat all the other alternatives available to Indians in the country at that time. With the arrival of the boomers in the 1950s, a boisterous element was added to the already unbalanced equation. As a type, roughnecks were provincial and bigoted, and had a great deal of difficulty making mental accommodations for the differences among people. They were unfamiliar with Navajo customs and lifestyles, and were the kind of people who laughed at the way Indians dressed, talked, and ate. They were rootless, transient lot, free. Few came to settle, they came for the work, and when they was gone, they weren't far behind, so their attachment to the land and sense of community shared no common ground with the tribal identification with Mother Earth. Often looked down on as oil field trash, they tended to do unto others that was done unto them. Most came from West Texas and Oklahoma and brought their bias against colors with them. Their dislike of Indians was in part an extension of how they felt about blacks. They were a bunch of lazy, shiftless, never-do's wells who came from inferior stock. You heard them say things like Indians just niggers, less well done. The way Dan Sullivan, who was chief of the police in Farmington, then tells it, this was when most of the white crimes against Indians started. The boomers didn't like Indians, and that's all there was to it. On their way out to the oil and gas wells, most were located on leased Navajo land. They would make a sport out of shooting holes in the Indians' water tanks, or think nothing of swerving off the dirt roads and pillowing a lane through an Indian's cornfield. Little things like that kept the Indians agitated, but they rarely retaliated. They knew there was no way they were going to win a fight with an Anglo in Farmington. If one started to get the best of a white, he'd have to deal with 3 or 4 of his pals. Oh, once in a while they'd get back. Some buckaroo's car might mysteriously catch fire one night, and he'd swear up and down it was an Indian who did it. And he was probably right, but it wasn't nothing I could land at someone's door. Worsening any and all Worsening an already tense situation, it was along almost here that Indians were given the legal right to drink. Everyone seemed to agree with the Navajo tribe deserves credit for its ability over the centuries to make adjustments and adaptations to the changing environment, incorporating those elements which were beneficial to its well-being and survival. And just as unanimous is the opinion that if there is one element that has been accepted that it has been detrimental, it is firewater. As far back as 1880, the Navajo agent with Lemnit, the crying evil that most besets these people is whiskey. 75 years later, that observation would just be as true. Some would say that terminating Indian prohibition laws didn't change anything. It only put a few bootleggers out of business, but talk to those in charge of law enforcement in the reservation border towns at this time and you hear a different story. Most greeted the change in the law with optimism. Prohibition had caused them all kinds of problems. Since Indians knew if they were caught with a bottle, it would be confiscated. As soon as they bought a quart of wine or whiskey, they would disappear into the alleys, empty buildings, and train yards, where they would end up the contraband as quickly as possible. Fast guzzling like that, it wasn't long before they passed out, making death from exposure a significant statistical fatality during the winter months. Now that an Indian could go into a bar and drink, officers hoped they would not have the same problem with their passing out and freezing in the gutters. But by the time the drinking pattern was ingrained, not the least because it was cheaper to buy booze by the bottle than by the glass, if anything, the problem was exacerbated. As the border towns became the watering holes for Indians with the thirst for liquor, at any time of day or night they could be found weaving down the street, slumped against buildings or huddled in a dark corner in the drunken stupor, where they were fair game for foul play as well as foul weather. The 60s were a time when the 18th century concept of the noble savage was portrayed the American Indian as innately brave and honorable, living in harmony with nature and at one with the world, a spiritually superior being, was enjoying a comeback that was due in large measure to revisionist historians who wrote about the cruelties and inequalities meted out to native peoples during the Western settlement in a fashion which has pricked white Americans' conscience that has suddenly became fashionable to champion Indian causes. To a generation discontented with urban industrial life, the Indian, not just for his religion, ecological ideals and values, but for his ability to survive a tragic history of concept and oppression with their ideals intact, epitomize the modern day anti-hero, where once his culture seemed destined to disappear under the dominance of white civilization, now it was revered as the antidote. But people in Farmington on the whole were indifferent to the trend that was taking place elsewhere in the nation, where they were unwilling or unable to share the benevolent and frankly admiring view of the Indian and his way of life because they felt they knew better. To their way of thinking, Easterners had always been soft on Indians. It was easy for those out of harm's way to dwell on the noble, not the savage part, those on the front lines from the pioneers and settlers who braved Indian resistance, to expand the national domain in the white residents of reservation border towns who dealt with them on a daily basis, possessed the actuality of personal experience in their minds that gave them an advantage, illumination, a more hard-edged realm about Indians. Until you've worked with and lived around them, they say your opinion is a tourist. You might not know, for example, that the Indian is not the same person he had been 100 years ago. Then he is often admired for things he no longer is. Don't try to tell Red Crampton about the noble red man. For years before he opened his Shell station on Main Street for business on Monday mornings, Red had to rouse the Navajos sleeping off their drunks in the lot out back and clean up the mess they'd made. It was hard for him not to think of all Indians as dirty, stupid people when most of the ones he saw were passed out on a pile of empty bottles with blue flies buzzing around their bloated faces. Some he had to poke with a boot toe to see if they were still alive. This has been going on for a long time before it was legal for Indians to drink. A mom and pop grocery store across the street would order several cases of vanilla extract each week and sell it all to Indians who drank it for alcohol content. When prohibition for Indians ended, the problem moved to another part of town, near the packaged liquor stores. But then a Safeway was built next door, and the problem came back. The law said you couldn't sell liquor on Sundays, but there was no law against buying Listerine, mouthwash, or Aquavelva aftershave or Aquanet hairspray, which were better than 10% alcohol, and drinking it. By the trash, you'd think there were a lot of sweet-smelling, well-groomed people walking around town. Not only did people in Farmington gripe about the attributes toward Indians that thought they were colorized by romantic myths and sentimentality, underlying their own perspective was a deep resentment of, in their opinion, misguided governmental policies and patronage. The town was mired in an economic slump during the 60s. Many residents had to struggle to maintain a decent standard of living. often going from paycheck to paycheck, worrying if they could meet the mortgage, pay their bills. In the oil business, you could be in the money one day and on the street the next, so you already achieved security. And out of the taxes paid on the hard earned income, the government was giving the Indians all these freebies. Indians got direct welfare payments, they got free medical services, they got free housing and education, all without having to put up any effort. They didn't have to work for it. It was available to them just because they were Indians. "They're like a kid living with parents," explained one unsympathetic local, "demanding all the comforts and benefits of home, wanting us to give them all these things they can't buy for themselves, but wish your kids can say, 'Okay, I'll keep you clothed and fed until you're 18, then you're on your own. It's up to you to get a job and take care of yourself.' The goddamn Indians, they're 80 years old and still living at home." Welfare for Indians went against the physiological grain of Farmington, where the frontier work ethic of self-reliance prevailed. The virtues of hard labor and entrepreneurship were admired, and people were encouraged to look after themselves, not to the government. Brigham Young was frequently cited as the authority on what happened to the recipients of government handouts. My experience has taught me that it has become a principle with me that it is never any benefit to give out to men or women money, food, clothing, or anything else. There is nothing on earth for them to do. This is my principle, and I try to act upon it. To pursue a contrary course would ruin any community to the world and make them idlers. Whenever the advice was recalled in Farmington, it wasn't just Mormons who uttered a resounding amen. Other than to celebrate certain holidays and on the occasion of annual sheriff posse parade, Farmington was not used to public processions down its thoroughfares. Having been spared the social turmoil of the 60s, there had been no street demonstrations protesting the Vietnam War in Farmington, no rebellious youths waving placards and chanting anti-American slogans to raise the blood pressure of local conservatives. To the townspeople, marching as a mode of publicizing discontent was something that happened only on the evening news. But like it or not, images that were tramped across the TV screens had come to town, images that could not be changed by switching to another channel. When the Indians had first applied for a parade permit to conduct a memorial march, Mayor Webb's reaction was no, not to this town. He was subsequently softened his position and decided to let them march, in part because no one could think of grounds for denial other than it had never been done before, and in part because the mayor did not feel he had a moral responsibility to respond to the killings. But when they requested a second permit with the idea of using city streets as a platform for protest, he had no intention of letting that happen, and said as much as a meeting with the inner circle of advisors convened to discuss the request. Secondly, his opinion was the city manager, C. M. Woodbury, a retired major general in the New Mexico National Guard, the commanding officer of a tank battalion in World War II, and a four-time recipient of the Silver Star. This thing would be stopped early before the descendants get to feeling their muscle. Woodbury insisted. He went on to say that his years of experience convinced him that civil disturbance were nourished by the permissiveness and restraint of authorities. "Let them continue to march and it will only get worse," summed up his point of view. The city attorney represented an only dissecting voice, but his position almost most was also the most informed. He pointed out that there were constitutional questions at stake, and public groups that had not yet acted in a socially disruptive manner were in fact legally entitled to march. Mayor Webb countered, although the first march had been peaceful and without incident, it had generated a considerable amount of anxiety. To allow Indians to march once again, particularly what their announced intention was to protest, could be interpreted as putting the town in a dangerous position. Chief of Police Roy Kerr, a veteran lawman who had attained national recognition with a Life magazine article, credited him with the cleaning up conditions in Tacoma, Washington, when it was known as a sin spot in the early 50s, and cited the advantage to letting the Indians march. It would make it easier for us to control the situation. On the permit, we stipulate the route, set the perimeters, and that way we know where they are at all time. Meanwhile, my men will be standing by, and at the slightest sign of trouble, we're ready to roll. Kerr's opinion held sway, with the conditions that the parade applicants and participants expressively agree to conduct themselves in an orderly and law-abiding manner, that no one carry any weapons, firearms, firecrackers, or explosives, and that in case of emergency or civil disorder, the participants would peacefully disband upon order of the police. That permit was approved. The second march was held on Saturday, May 11th, and everything about this march was different. It began in Shiprock, where hundreds, sorry, it's a puzzle. Um, the second march was held on Saturday, May 11th, and everything about the march was different. It began in Shiprock, where hundreds of people gathered early in the morning for a rally along the San Juan River, led by two police cruisers. The crowd began to walk San Juan River. The crowd began to walk the 20-odd miles to Farmington, stopping twice along the route for protests at the Zia and Turquoise bars. The roadside honky-tonk sitting along Highway 550, which more or less drew the northern perimeter of the reservation. There, Fred Johnson urged a boycott of the bars, and in a pathetic illustration of the problem, even though it was midday, the turquoise doors were locked for the first time in recent memory. So the audience for the ex- exhortations was a small band of six puzzled, red-eyed Indians who had been hovering around the bar since it had been closed down the night before. It was mid-afternoon by the time the marchers arrived in Farmington, and the size of the original group had swelled considerably. The Farmington newspaper would put the number at 250. The coalition leaders at 4,000. Perhaps the most accurate gauge of the rooftop police photo shows a mass of people filling both lanes of the downtown street, from sidewalk to sidewalk, for 7 blocks behind a banner that reads "March for Navajo Liberation." In stark contrast to the march the previous Saturday, in which the participants walked silently, the tone of this march was raucous, the messages written on many of the signs outright threatening, and they kept coming. A Farmington police officer will remember watching the protesters pour with the raging fluidity of a flash flood down one empty street after another, changing direction several times before turning on Airport Road and surging up the hill to Farmington City Hall. There were, under the watchful eye of police sharpshooters perched on the bluffs and squinting through their scopes, the coalition leaders stepped up onto a flatbed trailer and called out for social and economic equality, at end to prejudice and racism, justice in the case of the three murders, and a quick response to a list of 10 demands they were here presenting to Farmington city officials. Those demands began with an immediate open meeting with the Indian community and went on to demand greater sensitivity towards Indians. expanded employment opportunities, and participation by Indians in all aspects of community decision-making. What seemed like 1,000 fists stabbed the air when Wilbert the Sosi thrust the position in the direction of Mayor Marlowe Webb, who, to the surprise of many, not only had shown up at the rally but mounted the flatbed to receive it. Putting on a brave face, the mayor had to wait for the booing and catcalls to subside before he could address the crowd. When finally given a chance to speak, he said, "There is no way I can answer all these demands today, and it would be improper to try to do so, but on behalf of the citizens of Farmington, I accept them with a view toward looking into them." There would be those who would think the mayor intended to say no more. Then he felt this alone was a mere concession, and were it not for an ominous grumble from the young bucks in the crowd, he would not have realized the inadequacy of the response. Glanced down at the paper in his hand in a confusion and dismay, read the first demand calling for immediate open meeting with the mayor and the city council at which Indian people would be allowed to voice their grievances and concerns, and save himself embarrassment or worse by announcing then and there a public meeting would be held 2 days hence on Monday evening. The mayor denies this, but there is little disagreement that he seemed visibly relieved when the announcement was applauded and he beat a hasty retreat. Monday evening, the remarkable happened. An estimated 300 people, the majority of them Navajo, packed into the auditorium. The county fairgrounds, the 6 hours, a lengthy stream of speakers, some talking in Navajo, others in the foreign tongue, hurled insult upon complaint at the 6 members of the Farmington City Council and at Marlowe Webb. There was a fair amount of blustering as some Indians seized on the chance to sass authority figures and flaunt their contempt for protocol, uninterrupted jeering, and when it was their turn, expressing themselves in language literally sprinkled with expletives. But a number of issues important to the Indian community were also identified and presented in this sensational context. They could not be ignored. Included in the lunacy of alleged abuses was the systematic harassment, mistreatment, and discrimination by police, merchants, school, hospitals, and other area institutions. And then Wilbert Sosi, like a grand inquisitor, stepped up and damned the town itself. Every day, Indian people face hostility, disrespect, and abuse on the streets, in the schools, and in restaurants and shops. There is no regard for our human rights, no concern for our human dignity. It was this attitude that led to the fanatic murders of 3 of our people. Hold on, those were just. Oh, sorry. Um, None of those went over well with the mayor. When he agreed to set up this meeting, he had been thinking as a businessman. He had decided he would handle gripes from minority groups the same way he did customers in the car business, where he dealt daily with disgruntled people who were unhappy because their new car sprang an oil leak on their radiator overheated, let them sound off. But over the course of 6 hours, his patience was sorely tested. At first, he had tried to be congenial with the hostile crowd in response to Navajo requests for police protection. He had scanned the faces in the auditorium and half jokingly responded, "Maybe we're the ones who need protection." Larry Anderson of AIM had leaped to his feet to remind the mayor, "Navajos are the ones being murdered and they want protection." The mayor tightened, found it difficult to restrain sarcasm. After that, got caught up in some testy back and forth exchanges and almost lost it when Fred Johnson was deliberately was deliberately blasphemous, and Wilbert Sosey warned him that if he reforms were not forthcoming, we're going to turn this town upside down. At the very start of the evening, the mayor had said he and the council members had come to the meeting to listen, not to act. But those in attendance were wanting something concrete to come out of all the talk. For this to be more than just an exercise, specific actions had to follow. As much to appease the sentiment as to the act in accordance with the responsibilities in his position, Webb announced that later in the week he would appoint a fact-finding committee to examine in greater detail the matters brought before the council this evening. It was 1:30 in the morning by the time the parley was adorned, and even though his composure had slowly unraveled over the course of the evening, when he reflected on the meeting as a whole, Mayor Webb felt that overall it had gone remarkably well. To arrive at the conclusion, he ignored what he thought were examples of inflammatory rhetoric and unrealistic demands, and saw the events just ended as part of a strategy that had begun with the issuance of a second parade permit. The Indians had marched and it had gone without incident. Not only that, they had been allowed to have a powwow in the front of City Hall. In the gesture of consolation and in keeping with their first demand, he had called a town meeting. After an exhaustive griping session, he had agreed to appoint a committee to study the problem and come up with recommendations. What more would be expected of a reasonable city administrator? Driving home that night, the mayor found himself thinking that maybe the worst was over. Maybe now that the air was cleared, the tension that had obviously been building in the Indian community would lessen. Maybe Farmington had just avoided a long, hot summer. The meeting at the fairgrounds did not little to appease Wilbert Sosey. He thought it probably gave Navajo people the feeling they could express their feelings and some good might actually come out of it, but beyond that it had accomplished nothing. He had no faith in the kind of fact-finding committee the mayor was going to appoint, imagining it would most likely be composed of a hand-picked group of so-called leading citizens who knew nothing about Indian affairs. And when Webb had explicitly designated a commission recently formed by tribal, tribal council tribal chairman Peter McDonald as a group he intended to report to and work with, Wilbert felt the mayor had revealed his insidious intentions. No mention had been made of the Coalition for the Navajo Liberation, which said to Sosey that the mayor was refusing to accord in recognition as a legitimate negotiating body. Wilbert did not discount the possibility that the entire meeting had been a well-staged play designed to calm the natives while pulling public support out from under the coalition, and when editorial that blasted the CNL appeared 2 days later in the Farmington newspaper, he felt his opinion was confirmed. Self-appointed leaders. The manner in which a number of recently self-appointed spokesmen for the Navajo people have been conducting themselves is not representative of the overwhelming majority of responsible Indians residing in San Juan County. Violence and the threat of violence have never accomplished a single thing for the benefit of any minority group. Though these spokesmen place unreasonable demands on the duly elected officials of a community with the full knowledge that those demands cannot and will not be met. The people of Farmington have elected city officials who are legally responsible for the administration of city affairs. The voters of this city did not elect representatives of the Farmington Intertribal Indian Organization. They did not elect spokesmen for the American Indian Movement. For those organizations to attempt to usurp the right of the people of Farmington to elect our community leaders is ridiculous. Attempts to polarize racial or ethnic elements of an area of the name of human rights are hypocrisy. Effects to incite those elements to commit violence or illegal acts should be recognized for what they are. That is, to widen the gap which divides individual human beings and to bring about discord among the American people. The Navajo people have well-qualified representatives who have been elected according to the law. We think they are far more representative of the people than those who attempt to seize authority by playing on the emotions of minority. With all due respect, Wilbert expected no better from the Farmington Daily Times. The lack of what he felt to be fair and objective report of Indian issues had been a long-standing compliment of his. Legitimate news was relegated to back pages when Indians were the subject. There was no attempt to write with depth and social awareness about the realities of the Navajo neighbors. He agreed with Fred Johnson, who dubbed the paper the White Racist Bible of Farmington. He also thought the editorial erred in its assessment of the number of people the coalition represented. He felt that just as whites had their silent majority who rarely spoke out publicly on issues because they felt powerless and didn't think their voice would make a difference, so did Navajos, but it would be a mistake to think that they just because they didn't speak their minds, that meant they were content. If white people only knew how deeply resentful the Navajo people were toward them, they would sleep a lot less easily at night. Wilbert had other grounds for dismissing the charges, having considered a potential for backlash from the traditional Indian community. He had already sought out tribal councilmen from the region, chapter officials, and conservative Navajo business people who he expected would frown on militant activities to explain his position. To his surprise, he found that many of them felt at least as strongly as he did about the need to rearrange relations with the white community. Even if they were not comfortable marching, they made him feel that though it might not be their style, they were in symphony with his objectives. The next Saturday, for the third week in a row, 1,000+ demonstrators crammed into downtown Farmington. Speeches made during 2 stops along the parade route were both shrill and acrimonious. In front of a Main Street liquor establishment, Fred Johnson declared wars on the bars and accused their owners of being criminal profiteers. The white men had created a thirst for liquor in the Indians. He said he profited from the Navajo weakness for alcohol. He engaged in illegal activities, selling booze to obviously intoxicated Indians and to minors. And he refused to provide the resource for a single alcohol rehabilitation program. At the marchers' second stop, in front of Marlowe Webb Smoke Chevrolet dealership, a hot-eyed intellectual by the name of John Redhouse spoke. He stirred the crowd with what sounded to many like a call to arms. Later, Redhouse would explain himself this way: I felt in self-defense we should arm ourselves. We were being watched by armed cops. Police brutality was a pattern out there, so I felt that we should be ready and not allow ourselves to be helpless victims any longer. I wanted white Farmington to know we would retaliate with force if threatened with force. But the quotes that made the paper sounded a lot more aggressive. If law enforcement agencies do not bring the 3 murderers to justice, then we must be prepared to take the law into our own hands and retaliate against the subjects, their families, and the racist white community in Farmington. Wearing red and green armbands, the colors of the coalition, regional members of AIM were serving as parade marshals, walking on either side of the marchers and breaking up arguments with white hecklers before they got out of hand. There to provide security and crowd control, they looked like militia that would provide the first line defense if the parade were attacked. They were also the most vocal respondents when their commander, Larry Anderson, pledged the support of AIM, telling the crowd that he had been in contact by phone with its leaders, Russell Means and Dennis Banks, who stood solidly behind the Navajo people and had ordered representatives of AIM chapters in the Southwest to come to Farmington to assist local Indians to their fight. He said that more members of his organization were camped near Shiprock at this very minute and were prepared to move into Farmington for a direct confrontation if such action was required. In spite of surveillance techniques that had all the subsidy of watchtower guards glassing a prison yard, the coalition was not intimidated, and their rallies and marches continued to turn out impressive numbers of people. Perhaps the most important individual to swell their ranks was John Redhouse, compared to Fred Johnson, a one-man show, audacious and passionate, given to outrageous but emotionally powered speeches in a rhetoric of extremity. Red House was the epitome of rational pose and collaborated steadiness. He stood 6 feet tall, weighed close to 200 pounds, wore his hair at shoulder length, and looked at you through a wire-rimmed glasses that seemed to emit a concentrated beam of intensity. Farmington raised honorably discharged from the Army. He was currently enrolled at the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque, where he was a member of the Kiva Club, an Indian student organization. A sharp and serious young man who saw current conditions in Indian country as a continuation of the Indian Wars. His commitment to social justice for Navajos had taken him the previous year to Gallup, New Mexico, where he was involved in organizing a protest against the commercialization and exploitation of Indian culture and religion at the annual intertribal ceremonial. He had come blazing back into town when he read about the developments of Farmington. Red House varied the rhythms of the coalition leadership, and in the days following the Third March, when he met with Sosi and Johnson to brainstorm about activities to fan the growing mood of self-assertion and defiance in Farmington Indians, it was his recommendation that they expand their disruptions of business as usual to include an economic boycott. The campaign would be directed at the Farmington business community, which profited from Navajo dollars yet treated Navajo customers scornfully and also hired a token few. If we wanted to, he reminded his fellow leaders, we could conduct a boycott too strong, the city would go broke. The ideal of calling for a blanket boycott had a certain appeal to Wilbert Sosi, except he didn't believe it would work. What alternative do we provide people with then? If we ask them not to shop in Farmington because it's Navajo money that makes this town rich, where do we tell them to go? Gallup? Things are no better there. Besides, people aren't going to drive hundreds of miles to shop someplace else. Red House maintained that the call for a well-coordinated boycott of Farmington, even if it could not be pulled off, had value in a rhetorical sense. As part of a consciousness raising, what we need to look at and begin to move toward is the internal economic development of the Navajo Nation, because it is still a colony of the border towns, a colony of the corporations ripping off our resources. We need to develop an economic system that provides for our own goods and services so we don't have to demand on places like Farmington or Gallup, where our people are exploited. In the end, a tactical compromise was arranged. The coalition would raise the specter of an economic boycott as leverage. for discussions with city officials, but to show it wasn't bluffing, it would begin to target specific business about which they received complaints of racial discrimination. Most of the business people they contacted pled innocent, and of course, some of them, like the store manager at Safeway, refused to talk with them. But when they warned that they would come back again in far greater numbers if things did not change, a letter from Safeway headquarters informing them that it was not company policy to discriminate, but concerted effort would be made to hire more minorities, including Navajo, let them know their point had been made. At Sambo's restaurant, where there have been reports that Navajos were refused service, they were rudely turned away and responded as promised the very next day. They returned to conduct a sit-in, occupying every table, booth, counter, seat in the place, and sat there the entire afternoon. Nobody ordered anything but water. There were no raised voices, no combative arguments with the help. The only time anyone even addressed the glowering waitresses was to raise an empty glass and ask for more water. Meanwhile, the police had called and were watching in the windows, apparently under orders not to do anything unless an incident was provoked. Finally, around 6 in the evening, coalition leaders and the faithful filed out the door, and before the summer was over, Sambo's would change managers, and Navajo girls in orange and white uniforms were taking orders from customers. Working with limited resources, the coalition had no choice but to think creatively, and sometimes their antics were humorous as well as point. Take the way they protested appropriation of city funds for the construction of an animal shelter. For 2 years, Sosi had lobbied the city to build a decent Indian center. The old one, built in the 60s as a place where Indians who came to town could rest and find washroom that were often denied them in city gas stations and restaurants, was a shabby, rundown facility. As Sosi pointed out, an estimate 30% of the retail business in Farmington came from Navajo consumers, all of whom paid sales tax, and they deserve better accommodations. He'd been told, "We're not going to build a clubhouse for you and your cronies." So when the city council rejected the proposal once again, citing priorities, and proceeded to approve $40,000 for an animal shelter at the next council meeting, coalition members showed up at the city hall with their pets, filing the chamber with yapping dogs and mewling cats. When asked the meaning of this, they replied, "It appears you care more about dogs than Indians, even though we are human beings, so they have just as much right to be here, maybe more than we do." Other ideas never got beyond the scheming stage, such as the plan to sew 1,000 sheets together and drape them over a rocky ridge near Hogback, just of Shiprock, with a coalition slogan printed across the expanse. Sosi got the idea after reading a magazine article about an artist who wrapped an island off the coast of Florida with a pink plastic ribbon. They called it art, but it made news, and he figured that captured the attention of the national media. So would his banner, and it might have worked if he'd been able to raise money to buy a number of sheets it would take, and find enough people willing to stitch 1,000 together. As far how they would get the material up the side of the ridge, the thinking never got that far. The most dramatic performance by the coalition, one that a journalist from the National Observer would describe as touched by the kind of publicity genius that marked Southern campaigns of a decade ago, was staged at the city dump on Thursday afternoon, May 23rd. Billed as a press conference, reporters from local, regional, and national publications gathered along with several hundred Navajo Indians to watch the burning of a rag stuffed of Mayor Marlo Webb, hanging by its neck from a crooked cedar post. with an American flag stuck upside down in the styrofoam head. If all our peaceful legal methods fail, then Farmington will go up in flames, physically and literally, John Redhouse vowed. Drawing the string on a 6-foot bow, Fred Johnson proclaimed, "The fight has just begun," before he sent an arrow whistling in the mayor's likeness, symbolically assassinating the man that the coalition had dubbed the Custer of Farmington. Twice before in this century, peaceful coexistence between Anglos and Navajos had been threatened. Once back in 1913, when a Navajo medicine man practicing plural marriage fled prosecution and holed up on top of Beautiful Mountain with the 3 wives and 9 armed braves, where they were surrounded by U.S. cavalry troops, and again in the 1930s when the government solution to the overgrazing problem on the reservation was a mandatory stock reduction plan, provoking bitter resentment and approaching, but never reaching outright revolt. Neither situation bore an instructive resemblance to the conflict Mayor Webb found himself confronted with, however, and the escalation of activism after the meeting left him edgy and impatient. He realized he had been wrong about the way it had gone. The bloodletting had created a bloodthirst. Things were getting worse. Curdling everything he was feeling was a righteous indication because he felt an honest attempt had been made. He truly believed he had done all within reason and his power to respond responsibly to the situation. He had tried his best to establish a dialogue with the descendants and bring those who warned their voices to be heard into the political process, but they had rejected his plea to stop the marching until solutions were arrived at, and refused his appeal that hereafter they express their opinions on city affairs and social problems through normal channels. All they did was reiterate their demands. They wouldn't listen to reason, and they accused him of making excuses when he tried to point out that some of their demands were too dubious to respond to. For example, when they said they wanted to be recognized and respected as human beings, he had no idea how to begin to meet such a demand. It sounded to him like what they wanted was a change in attitude, but that was not something that could be passed like law. That occurred over time, not overnight or upon demand. And when they did have specifics, either they were complaints against individuals without evidence to corroborate their statements, had no charges had been filed at the time, or they were unhappy with policies and practices over which the city had no jurisdiction and was not authorized to address. Privately, Mayor Webb thought that the most of what came from coalition was the turgid cant of revolutionaries who claim that behind their militancy is a commitment to enfranchise a needy class, when the truth was they were doing it for personal notoriety, media exposure, and a grab for power. He disagreed with just about everything they said, and in particular objected to the ideas that the town should pick up the tab for the murders. Nor did he believe local businesses were guilty of discrimination against Navajos. That wouldn't make sense for the very good reason that most businesses in Farmington counted on Navajos for their economic well-being, and it would be against their interest to alienate the very people their livelihood depended on. If you didn't treat a customer right, he would take his money someplace else. By appointing a fact-finding commission and promising that once it brought its conclusions and recommendations to him, they would receive prompt and proper attention at the appropriate government units. He felt he was showing a clear willingness to work for the improvement of interracial relations. The commission, he hoped, would provide a mechanism that would enhance communication and provide solutions. But that had not been good enough for the Indians. When he announced his appointments to the 13-man Navajo Relations Committee at the end of the week, they had booed his selection of Chairman Everett Kennedy, Executive Vice President of Citizens Bank in Farmington. They had criticized the fact that he had not appointed any coalition members to the committee and that he intended to work with the legally elected officials of the Navajo tribe. And again, the next Saturday they had marched trying up downtown traffic and disrupting normal weekday activity. Feeling that each and every effort he had made had been rebuffed by the coalition leaders, he had shown nothing but contempt for the political process and displayed an arrogant disregard for decency. The mayor decided that further consideration of the viewpoint would be unproductive and he would no longer conduct discussions with anyone associated with the Coalition for Navajo Liberation. He then issued a statement to the press in which he read, "Although we are vitally concerned with improving relations between red and white, we can no longer deal with men who seek violence intent of friendship and who represent only a small militant portion of the Navajo community." In addition to concluding that coalition leaders were not truly interested in sitting down to reason and counsel together, and that he was dealing with troublemakers trying to capitalize on a tragedy by exploiting emotions generated by the murders, the mayor felt he had good reason to believe that this was not grassroots movement supported by real Farmington Navajos. It had been his observation that most of the protesters who were marching had come in off the reservation, who said to him that the local Indians must therefore be content. As for the leadership of coalition, Fred Johnson's base of operations was Shiprock, and John Redhouse had been living in Albuquerque for years and only returned when the parading started. On those grounds alone, Webb felt he was justified in disregard for their demands. They were asking for representation for their reservation, Navajo, and his responsibility was to the citizens of Farmington, people living within city limits and having an ongoing relationship with the community. But the point was dwarfed by a larger issue, the presence of people who claim an affiliation with the American Indian movement. Larry Anderson was reputed to be a national treasurer. At the second march, the national chairman of AIM, John Trudell, who had been active in the Indian takeover of Alcatraz, had shown up, and there were others who boisted off their membership. Maybe they weren't and were just saying so because they thought it gave them status, but it furthered the impression that AIM was working behind the scenes. And those were the ones we were most feared of, the mayor would remember thinking. They had a known history of violence, and some of them gave you this distinct impression they'd just as soon cut your throat at. Let's see. They had known history of violence, and some of them gave you the distinct impression they'd just as soon cut your throat as look at you. Nor was AIM the only non-town submersive organization suspected of showing an interest in inciting civil unrest. At a meeting with the local FBI agent who was monitoring events closely, Webb was informed that a background check of a local priest, one of the few whites marching with the Indians, had turned up information out of his past that identified him as a communist sympathizer. Whether it was AIM, the communists or whomever, Webb felt he had heard and seen enough to convince him that he was dealing with something fomented by outside agitators. These were not the Navajo people he knew. These were people from elsewhere and expressing what sounded to him like imported ideas. As sure as the fact he was, neither Webb nor his inner circle of advisers knew what they were dealing with or what they expect next. Rumors had come off the street that a caravan carrying 1,000 armed braves summoned by AIM were on the way from South Dakota, conjuring images of insertion that flashed strobe-like in the mayor's head. Automobiles flipped over, set afire, shadowy figures fleeing ransacked businesses through smashed windows, and nights crackling with gunfire, charred blocks patrolled by National Guardsmen. At the time, the intelligence gathered by law enforcement agencies on militant activities on the reservation was woeful. The FBI claimed to have been infiltrated AIM in South Dakota, but in Navajo land. Other than reports filed by undercover agents, he had attended the publicized coalition meetings. There were no reliable inside information. So when the authorities were unable to give the mayor the assurances he wanted, he placed a call to Governor Bruce King. After conveying the seriousness of the situation, Webb expressed his concern that the Navajo Police Department did not have the personnel, the training, or the experience to handle all the scenarios, and he brought up the possibility of mobilizing the National Guard. After a round of discussions among top state officials, Mayor Webb was told such a mobilization might be provocative and there was not a clear need at that point. Nonetheless, the potential for violence was high enough that the Northern Zone Tactical Team of the New Mexico State Police, who were practiced at handling prison riots, would be deployed to the Farmington on the upcoming weekend. The Indian marched. Working out with the Guard Armory, they would assemble in full battle dress in a parking lot of Main Street, where idling buses would move them in immediately after the first torch was thrown, the first shots fired. As a final safety measure, a document was sent which in effect gave the mayor the power to impose martial law. He kept in his desk drawer, and it would take is his signature at the bottom, and the National Guard would immediately be called up to clear the streets of people, make mass arrests if necessary, and enforce hold on enforce a curfew. Once he felt that the city of Farmington was in position to protect itself against social disruption, the mayor found himself considering personal precautions. He had received numerous threats to his face, and over the phone he took them seriously. Also in the back of his mind was an incident less than a year old that had put city officials in border towns all around the Navajo reservation on notice. Two young Indians active in the Gallup protest had resorted to desperate measures and kidnapped its mayor at gunpoint. Fortunately, the mayor had escaped by throwing himself through a plate glass window just before shooting started. One of the Indians survived. The other was celebrated as a martyr whose sacrifice showed the white world that Indians were prepared to die for their cause. Knowing the coalition had touted the kid killed in the The kid killed in the Frostiers as a folk hero, Marlowe Webb took no chances. Each morning when he dressed for work, he armed himself with a snub-nosed .38 with a 2-inch barrel that fit comfortably in a shoulder holster under his arm. That is the end of chapter 6. That was not bad. The next